The black stallion exploded from the splintered pen. Like fury incarnate his hooves, striking sparks from the sun-scorched earth of Deadman's crossing. Eleanor Drake felt the impact in her bones, the same methodical rhythm as the hammers that had sealed Marcus's coffin 3 years ago. Now watching this magnificent beast rear against the Texas sky, she saw her own reflection in his wild, desperate eyes, the look of something that had lost everything but refused to surrender. Men scattered like tumbleweeds, shouting and grabbing for guns as the horse's hooves crashed mere yards from Eleanor's black mourning dress. Tom Bradley hollered from behind a water barrel, "Mrs. Drake, get away from that devil!" But Eleanor had not survived 27 years on the frontier by retreating from devils. She tightened her grip on Marcus's silver-headed walking stick and stepped closer. This stallion represented everything her husband had dreamed of: horses tough enough to survive the killing heat and sudden blizzards, animals with a heart to carry a man across impossible distances. The auctioneer in Fort Stockton had sworn this horse came from legendary Mustang bloodlines. Eleanor had paid $300 more than most families earned in 2 years because she could see Marcus's vision made flesh in the animal's powerful shoulders and intelligent eyes. The beast had already killed 2 of her hands. Jake Morrison trampled in 6 seconds, and Miguel Santos crushed so thoroughly they'd needed a shovel for his burial. "Easy now," Eleanor murmured as the stallion's massive head swung toward her voice. Woman and animal regarded each other across a distance measured in shared grief. She saw old scars along his flanks, marks from spurs and whips, and recognized the desperate defiance she'd worn since Marcus's funeral. The stallion snorted and wheeled away, with fluid grace circling the town square while avoiding the clusters of men, but seeming less aggressive now. "That animal's a man-killer, Mrs. Drake," said Ben Doyle, appearing with his peculiar quietness. Her ranch foreman was a weathered man in his early 60s, with iron-gray hair and pale eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He'd helped build their operation from ramshackle buildings into one of the most prosperous spreads in West Texas. But something in his voice when he spoke of the stallion made Eleanor uneasy, a satisfaction that had nothing to do with her welfare. "Perhaps they simply weren't the right men," Eleanor said carefully. Doyle's laugh was harsh as grinding stone. "Some things are just too wild to exist around decent folk." The stallion stood pawing near Sullivan's saloon, his sides heaving, but his head held high in uncompromising defiance. This was exactly what Marcus had dreamed of breeding. "I'll pay $200 to any man who can break that horse," Eleanor announced. The declaration silenced the square. $200 was more than most saw in a year, but the crowd shuffled their feet, remembering what the stallion had done to experienced horsemen. "Well, that money ain't worth dying for," called Billy Cutler, a young cowboy. "Every man has his price, Mr. Cutler," Eleanor replied with authority. "The question is whether any of you have the courage to claim yours." That was when she saw him. The stranger materialized from the eastern approach, like heat shimmer gaining substance, riding a trail-worn bay mare. He was tall with copper-dark skin, weathered by wind and sun, his black hair streaked with gray and pulled back with leather. A faded shirt showed patches, and a scar ran across his chest beneath the worn fabric. As he dismounted and tied his horse outside Sullivan's, Eleanor studied his economical movements, the deliberate grace of someone who understood that wasted motion could mean death on the frontier. "Comanche." Someone whispered the words, spreading like smoke. Eleanor felt possibility stir in her chest. This man carried himself differently, no swagger or posturing, just quiet confidence that suggested he understood horses in ways most white men never would. The stranger's gaze found the stallion, and Eleanor saw recognition flicker in his weathered features, not fear or bloodlust, but something like kinship. "You hear about the horse?" Doyle asked with casual contempt. "I heard," the stranger replied, his English clear despite the accent. Eleanor made her decision with quick certainty. "What's your name?" "Nashoba," he replied, and she heard murmurs of recognition from older townsmen. She stepped forward, noting the intelligence in his dark eyes and controlled tension in his posture, a survivor who'd reached middle age in country where few of his people lived to see gray hair. "Well, Nashoba," Eleanor said clearly, "I have a proposition. Break that horse, truly tame him, and I'll pay you double. $400 right here in front of everyone." The sum drew gasps. $400 could buy a small ranch enough to start over anywhere. But Eleanor was watching Nashoba's face, seeing something that had nothing to do with money, a recognition that seemed soul-deep, as if he and the stallion shared understanding beyond commerce. As her fingers unconsciously brushed the small object in her coat pocket, a tarnished badge she'd carried for 3 years, without understanding why Eleanor felt forces larger than simple horse-breaking gathering in Deadman's Crossing. "You accept?" she asked. Nashoba studied the stallion with the intensity of a man reading sacred text, cataloging details. Others missed the set of ears pattern of scars, the way he held his head that spoke of breeding as much as wildness. "I accept," he said finally, his voice carrying finality that suggested this moment had been inevitable. Eleanor retrieved a coiled rope and tossed it to him, feeling like she was casting dice with fate itself. As the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, Eleanor Drake was about to discover whether she'd found the man to fulfill her husband's dream, or whether she'd just signed another death warrant in the unforgiving ledger of the American frontier. Nashoba approached the corral gate with measured deliberation, each step calculated to avoid spooking the massive stallion. The animal stood motionless at the far end, every muscle coiled, dark eyes fixed on this new threat with predatory focus. Eleanor held her breath as man and horse regarded each other across 30 feet of alkali dust. There was something ritualistic about the moment, as if both creatures were following ancient protocol that had nothing to do with the crude expectations of watching townsmen. The gate creaked as Nashoba slipped inside. The stallion's ears flattened in warning, but he made no move to charge yet. Then everything exploded. The animal came like black lightning hooves, drumming thunder against packed earth as he bore down with lethal intent. Nashoba didn't panic. He threw himself sideways in a controlled roll along the fence, so close, Eleanor swore she saw the stallion's breath ruffle his graying hair. The crowd erupted in raucous cheering. "Lasted longer than Mexican Pete," someone shouted gleefully. 5 seconds, who's betting on 6? Eleanor felt disgust rise like bitter medicine. These men were treating potential death as entertainment, wagering on human suffering as casually as cockfights. Nashoba was already back on his feet, brushing dust from his patched shirt with unhurried movements. The stallion had wheeled at the far end and now stood pawing sides, heaving, but attention focused entirely on the man who dodged his attack. "What is Stallion? This is what passes for horsebreaking among heathen tribes," Ben Doyle announced with theatrical disdain. Rolling in dirt like a circus performer. Laughter rippled through portions of the crowd. But Eleanor noticed older cowboys weren't joining the mockery. These were riders who recognized genuine skill even when performed by someone they'd been taught to consider inferior. The stallion charged again, this time with less fury, but more calculation. At the last moment, Nashoba sidestepped and slapped the horse's flank with his palm, not hard enough to hurt, but firmly enough to surprise and demonstrate that contact was possible without violence. The stallion stumbled from shock more than impact, then whirled with what Eleanor could only describe as indignation. His massive head was raised high, nostrils flared, but something had changed in his posture, grudging recognition that he was dealing with someone who understood the rules of engagement. "Interesting," Eleanor murmured, recognizing something that reminded her of Marcus's approach to difficult animals. "Interesting don't mean effective," Doyle observed, moving closer. "That savage is just postponing the inevitable. Animals like that always win, they got nothing to lose." Eleanor studied her foreman's profile, noting the particular intensity with which he watched. There was something almost personal in his antipathy that went beyond simple racial prejudice. "You seem certain of the outcome," Eleanor said carefully. "I've seen his kind before." Doyle replied, hands unconsciously clenching. They think they understand animals better than civilized folk, but when survival's at stake, they're just as helpless. Maybe more so. The edge in his voice made Eleanor's skin prickle, carrying undertones that reminded her of hushed conversations in the months before Marcus's death discussions that stopped abruptly when she entered rooms. In the corral, Nashoba was speaking to the stallion in flowing Comanche syllables that rose and fell like music. The horse's ears were no longer flattened, but pricked forward with interest, and while he remained poised for violence, his entire posture had shifted from pure aggression to wary curiosity, mixed with faint hope. "What's he doing?" Eleanor asked herself. "Comanche horse magic," someone whispered fearfully. "Ain't no magic," declared Pete Morrison, the blacksmith. "Just Indian foolishness. That horse is gonna stomp him flat." But Eleanor was watching with eyes trained by years, observing Marcus work with difficult stock. She could see changes in the stallion that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with patient, intelligent communication. The animal's head was lowering slightly, ears flickering between aggressive flattening and curious positioning. Most tellingly, he was no longer constantly pawing a sign. His focus was shifting from attack to assessment. "He's listening," Eleanor breathed wonderingly. "What?" Doyle's voice was sharp. "The horse. He's actually listening to what Nashoba is saying." The stallion made another pass, but this was clearly more test than attack. His teeth were bared in warning, but he pulled up short of contact as if inviting response rather than delivering assault. Nashoba extended his hand, slowly palm up, and began speaking again in that musical tongue. The stallion sniffed his fingers, curiously jerked back when someone shouted, and then returned almost immediately with determination to complete this strange ritual. Eleanor felt something stirring she hadn't experienced since Marcus's funeral. Genuine hope mixed with painful recognition of dreams that might yet be fulfilled. "This is taking too long," complained Billy Cutler impatiently. "When's he going to ride the thing?" "Patience, Mr. Cutler," Eleanor said firmly. "Good things come to those who understand proper timing." But patience was apparently scarce among certain crowd members. Eleanor noticed Doyle conferring with townsmen in deliberately low voices, their faces set in expressions she'd learned to associate with brewing trouble. Getting ideas above his station, she caught in fragments. What if he succeeds and word spreads? Can't let them think they can waltz back here. Eleanor felt ice forming as she understood what had started, as entertainment was evolving into something dangerous. The possibility that Nashoba might succeed threatened certain community members in ways that had nothing to do with horse breeding and everything to do with maintaining established social order. In the corral, Nashoba had managed to run his hands along the stallion's neck. The horse stood trembling but motionless, dark eyes fixed on the man's face. With desperate hope, the look of a creature hurt too many times, but still yearning for gentleness. Eleanor could see old scars beneath the midnight coat, evidence of brutal treatment by previous handlers who tried to break his spirit through systematic cruelty. Nashoba's weathered fingers traced these marks with gentle precision, as if reading the story of abuse and offering wordless understanding. My husband would have appreciated this approach. Eleanor said more to herself than anyone. "Ma'am." Sheriff Tom Hawkins had materialized beside her, looking increasingly uncomfortable as tensions built. Marcus always said breaking a horse was like breaking a person. You could do it with enough force, but you destroy what made them valuable. The truth was more complex than Eleanor admitted aloud. Marcus had possessed almost intuitive understanding of animals, but he'd also been troubled by casual violence witnessed during frontier years. In his final months, he'd spoken often about finding better ways to accomplish necessary tasks. Methods that didn't require systematic destruction of spirit and dignity. A commotion near Sullivan's drew her attention. Doyle was emerging carrying a bullwhip, his face set in grim lines. Eleanor recognized from times he'd dealt with claim jumpers the expression of a man preparing to use violence to solve problems negotiation couldn't address. "This has gone on long enough," Doyle announced with authority. That animal needs to understand who's in charge, not be coddled like some pet. Eleanor felt alarm spike through her. Ben, you will not interfere. Mrs. Drake, that's $400 at stake. Doyle interrupted, moving toward the gate. This Indian's just playing games, getting that horse confused instead of showing proper discipline. Before Eleanor could stop him, Doyle had entered the corral. The stallion, which had been standing calmly beside Nashoba, immediately tensed at the newcomer's aggressive energy, ears flattening in unmistakable warning. Ben. Eleanor's voice cracked like thunder. Get out of there. But Doyle was already raising the whip-braided leather, uncoiling with practiced precision. Back away, Indian. Time to show how civilized men handle livestock. The whip's sharp crack split afternoon air like gunfire. The stallion screamed and reared hooves, flailing dangerously as 15 minutes of delicate progress evaporated in brutal intervention. Nashoba dove for fence safety, while Doyle prepared to strike again, his face twisted with satisfaction of asserting dominance through superior force. Stop! Eleanor grabbed the corral fence with white knuckles. Benjamin Doyle, I order you to stop. Instead, Doyle brought the whip down across the stallion's flanks with a sound like ripping canvas. The horse exploded into pure fury, bucking and striking in all directions, eyes rolling white with terror and renewed rage. In the chaos, one hoof caught Nashoba across the shoulder, spinning him into the water trough with a splash that sent muddy liquid cascading across the corral. The crowd's reaction was immediate and revealing. Some cheered Doyle's intervention, while others called for order. But Eleanor could hear uglier undercurrents, the particular excitement that came from watching violence visited upon someone considered fundamentally other. As Nashoba struggled from the trough, dark hair plastered to his skull and shirt transparent with moisture revealing his chest scar, Eleanor saw something in Doyle's expression that chilled her blood. This wasn't about protecting her investment or demonstrating technique. This was personal in ways she was only beginning to understand. Eleanor watched Nashoba emerge from the water trough, like a man rising from baptism rivulets, streaming from his copper skin. Instead of retreating in defeat, as the crowd expected, he simply stood there, dripping and patient, wringing moisture from his shirt with movements that spoke of unbroken determination. The stallion had backed against the far fence, magnificent head, thrown high eyes, rolling with renewed terror. All of Nashoba's careful progress, 15 minutes of delicate communication and gradually building trust, had been undone by 30 seconds of Doyle's brutal intervention. You satisfied now? Doyle sneered, coiling his whip with practiced efficiency, while pale eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. That's how you handle a dangerous animal, with strength and discipline, not whatever heathen nonsense you were trying. Scattered laughter rippled through portions of the crowd. But Eleanor noticed several older cowboys weren't joining the mockery. These were men who understood horses at levels deeper than simple domination, and they'd witnessed what Nashoba had been accomplishing before Doyle destroyed it. Instead of responding with anger or wounded pride, Nashoba did something that stunned Eleanor with its quiet dignity. He checked his injured shoulder, carefully testing for serious damage, then began walking slowly back toward the terrorized stallion, with the same patient persistence he'd shown from the beginning. He's going back in there, someone whispered in amazement. Damn fool's got a death wish, another voice added, though there was grudging respect mixed with contempt. Eleanor held her breath as Nashoba resumed his gentle approach, speaking again in flowing Comanche, despite the violence he'd endured. His voice remained steady and musical, carrying no trace of anger toward the animal that had injured him or the man who'd caused the confrontation. Motor Ben. She called sharply, infusing her voice with all the authority she'd accumulated during 27 years managing ranch operations. Get out of that corral immediately. Her foreman's weathered face flushed dark red, but he complied with obvious reluctance, exiting while muttering curses. However, his expression had undergone fundamental change from casual contempt to something harder and more dangerous, the look of a man who'd revealed more than intended and was calculating consequences. Eleanor began understanding this confrontation involved far more than simple horsebreaking. Old tensions were surfacing like underground springs, bringing accumulated sediment and bitter taste of secrets buried but not forgotten. As Nashoba resumed patient work, Eleanor became increasingly aware of hostile undercurrents flowing through certain crowd segments. What had begun as skeptical entertainment was hardening into something potentially lethal, as Nashoba's skill transformed him from harmless curiosity into perceived threat to established order. "Sheriff Hawkins," she called quietly, drawing the lawman aside. "I think we may have trouble developing." Tom Hawkins was practical. He'd kept peace in Deadman's Crossing for 8 years by understanding when to act and when to wait. He followed Eleanor's gaze to men clustering around Doyle and nodded grimly. "I see it. Mob mentality forming like storm clouds. But as long as that Indian doesn't break territorial laws, there's not much I can do to prevent talk. And if talk turns to action, then I'll deal with it according to my oath." Hawkins replied, though Eleanor heard uncertainty beneath his confidence. Tom Hawkins was one man with a badge facing potential mob violence that might include the county's most influential citizens. In the corral, Nashoba was making remarkable progress despite Doyle's setback. The stallion's ears had lost their aggressive flattening and were pricked forward with obvious interest. While remaining alert for danger, he was again allowing Nashoba within touching distance, testament to both the man's skill and the animal's desperate need for gentleness. Eleanor watched Nashoba's weathered hands trace the network of old scars along the stallion's neck and flanks marks, speaking eloquently of whips and spurs of men who'd attempted to break the animal's spirit through systematic pain application. There was something almost reverent in the way Nashoba touched these wounds, as if acknowledging not just individual suffering, but some larger pattern of cruelty connecting them both. "Look at that," Eleanor murmured, recognizing something she'd witnessed in Marcus during final months, a man attempting to heal old wounds through gentle persistence, rather than adding to the world's violence. But her moment of hope was interrupted by Doyle's voice, deliberately raised for the entire crowd. "That Indian's got no business here," he announced with authority. "We all know what happens when their kind gets ideas above their station." The words carried undertones that stiffened Eleanor's spine with alarm. She'd heard Doyle use similar language before in months leading up to various incidents that left blood on ground and questions never quite answered satisfactorily. "What exactly do you mean, Ben?" Eleanor asked, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone demanding absolute clarity. Doyle's face went carefully blank, a man who'd said more than intended and was retreating without losing face. "Just saying some things are better left alone, Mrs. Drake. That horse has killed 2 good men. Adding a third won't bring them back." But Eleanor was studying his pale eyes, reading emotions flickering behind controlled expression. She could see something that had nothing to do with public safety and everything to do with personal specific fear, as if Nashoba's presence threatened something Doyle had worked hard to keep hidden. "You know him," Eleanor said suddenly, the words emerging from instinctive understanding before conscious processing. "Know who?" Doyle replied. But his voice carried the particular falseness of a man caught in a lie. "This man, Nashoba. You've encountered him before." The accusation hung in desert air like distant smoke, and Eleanor saw recognition flicker not just in Doyle's eyes, but in faces of several other men, older settlers who'd been in Deadman's Crossing. Long enough to remember events younger residents knew only as whispered stories. In the corral, Nashoba had succeeded in placing both hands on the stallion's powerful neck, and the horse was standing quietly despite obvious tension radiating from the crowd. But Eleanor noticed Nashoba's attention was now clearly divided between the animal and the group of men whose hostility was becoming increasingly obvious. "There's something else you're not telling me." Eleanor continued, following instinct she couldn't name, but which was growing stronger. "Something specific about why you're so determined to see this man fail." Doyle's carefully maintained composure finally began cracking under direct questioning, revealing glimpses of hard anger and old fear beneath his weathered facade. His father, he said finally, words emerging like poison drawn from infected wound. His father was here 15 years ago, stirring up trouble among local tribes, filling their heads with dangerous ideas about supposed rights to land and water that belonged to civilized people. Eleanor felt puzzle pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. What happened to his father? What happened to all troublemakers back then? Doyle replied with grim satisfaction that made Eleanor's skin crawl. We dealt with him permanent-like, the way frontier communities have always dealt with threats to public safety. The words settled over the crowd like dust from collapsed building, heavy and suffocating. Eleanor understood with crystalline clarity that she was witnessing the unveiling of secrets certain people had worked very hard to keep buried. You killed his father, she said, not a question, but a statement demanding only acknowledgement. Doyle's face hardened into familiar lines of justification Eleanor had seen on men explaining away violence throughout her frontier years, the expression of someone who'd convinced himself terrible actions had been necessary, and therefore righteous. We protected this community and our families, he said firmly, voice carrying conviction of someone who'd rehearsed these words many times. That Comanche was trying to steal everything we'd worked to build, claiming his people had ancient rights to water sources civilized folks depended on for survival. We did what needed doing when legal authorities were too distant to handle threats. Eleanor looked toward the corral where Nashoba had gone completely still, hands resting motionless on the stallion's neck, while his entire attention focused on the conversation beyond the fence. The horse, sensing change in his handler's energy, grew calm, as well as if recognizing a kindred spirit in grief. He came looking for you. Eleanor realized aloud, understanding flooding through her. That's why he's really here. Not for money, not even for the horse. He came seeking the men who murdered his father. Most likely. Doyle admitted weathered hand, moving unconsciously toward his gun. But he ain't going to find what he's looking for. This isn't Indian territory anymore, and we made sure it stays that way. Eleanor felt ground shifting as she understood her husband's dream of breeding perfect frontier horses was the least significant thing happening in Deadman's Crossing this afternoon. She was witnessing collision between past and present, between old secrets and new reckonings. But as she watched Nashoba place his forehead against the stallion's neck in a gesture offering mutual comfort to two wounded souls, Eleanor realized this story was far from over, and the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward western horizon, painting the desert in shades that seemed entirely too appropriate for what was about to unfold. The weight of decision pressed down on Eleanor like oppressive heat. She could end this confrontation, now pay Nashoba something, and send him away, before simmering tensions boiled over into violence that left men dead and communities stained with blood. It would be the safe choice, the practical choice, that wouldn't force her to examine uncomfortable truths about people she'd trusted and the community she'd called home for 3 decades. Instead, she heard herself saying with clear authority, "Continue with the horse, Mr. Nashoba. You have an agreement to fulfill, and I intend to honor my word regardless of distractions." Doyle's face went dark with anger and something increasingly like fear. "Mrs. Drake, you're making a serious mistake. That Indian's got revenge on his mind, not horsebreaking. He's dangerous in ways you don't understand." "Then it's fortunate that revenge isn't part of our business arrangement," Eleanor replied with ice-cold authority. "And unless someone can show me where Mr. Nashoba has broken territorial laws, I see no reason why a legitimate transaction should be interrupted by unfounded speculation." The crowd's mood was shifting like weather patterns, and Eleanor could feel violence gathering like electricity before thunderstorms. What had begun as skeptical entertainment was hardening into something far more dangerous, as certain community segments began viewing Nashoba's skill not as impressive horsemanship, but as direct challenge to racial hierarchy that kept places like Deadman's Crossing functioning according to established social order. Sheriff called Pete Morrison the blacksmith, his voice carrying authority of someone who employed several men. "You going to let this stand, having one of their kind back in our town after what happened before? What message does that send to other tribes?" Hawkins looked profoundly uncomfortable, weathered hand resting on his gun while expressions cycled through uncertainty and responsibility weight. "The man hasn't broken any laws, Pete. Yet." "Yet," Doyle repeated meaningfully, pale eyes glittering. "That's the key word, Sheriff. Yet. But we know how these things usually end, with good people dead and property destroyed." Eleanor recognized the tone from previous Deadman's Crossing incidents, the particular combination of righteousness and bloodlust that preceded most frontier lynchings, careful building of justification that allowed ordinary men to commit extraordinary violence while sleeping peacefully afterward. But in the corral, something genuinely remarkable was happening. Nashoba had managed to slip a rope halter over the stallion's magnificent head, and the horse was accepting this symbol of human control with calm dignity of an animal that had finally found someone worthy of trust. The transformation was so complete, several crowd members had fallen silent despite earlier hostility, recognizing they were witnessing something extraordinary skill and understanding that transcended simple domination through superior force. "Well, I'll be damned," breathed Billy Cutler wonderingly. "He's actually doing it. That horse is accepting him like they were old friends." But Eleanor could see Nashoba's success was making him more dangerous in certain townspeople's eyes rather than less. A failure could have been dismissed as evidence of inherent inferiority, confirming comfortable assumptions. Success suggested capabilities that threatened these assumptions and raised uncomfortable questions. "Ben," Eleanor said quietly, drawing her foreman away from the crowd. "Tell me exactly what happened to this man's father 15 years ago. All of it." Doyle's hands clenched so tight, his knuckles showed white, and Eleanor saw him struggle with how much truth to reveal. Finally, he seemed to reach internal conclusion. His father came to town in late spring of 1838. Doyle said, voice pitched low, but carrying clearly. Called himself Joseph Three Horses, claimed to be some kind of official representative of the Comanche nation sent to investigate complaints about water rights violations. Said his people had been using these springs for generations before white settlers showed up. Eleanor felt something cold settling in her stomach. "And what did you do?" "What any sensible men would do when faced with that kind of threat." Doyle continued, voice taking bitter edge. "We investigated his story, talked to territorial authorities, tried to handle it through proper legal channels." He paused, and Eleanor could see him editing his account in real time. "The problem was your husband," Doyle said finally, and Eleanor felt her heart skip beats as Marcus's name entered the conversation unexpectedly. "What about Marcus? Your husband believed that Indian story?" "Completely." Said the man showed him official documents, territorial papers that looked authentic, even some kind of federal authorization that seemed to give him legitimate authority to investigate treaty violations. Eleanor stared as puzzle pieces she'd never known existed began clicking into place with horrible clarity. Marcus supported his claims, more than supported them, Doyle said with obvious disgust. Marcus wanted to negotiate, wanted to work out some kind of sharing arrangement. He actually started gathering evidence to support Joseph Three Horses' case, interviewing settlers, documenting water usage, building legal arguments that would have undermined everything we'd established. The revelation struck Eleanor like physical blow, explaining so many things about Marcus's final months. She'd never understood his withdrawal from ranch operations, his preoccupation with organizing papers and writing letters. He never sent his strange insistence on making detailed records of seemingly mundane conversations and events. Marcus was trying to help improve his case. Eleanor said, not a question. Your husband had ideas about peaceful coexistence, that would have gotten every white family in this county killed or driven off their land. Doyle said bluntly. Some of us had to think practically about survival and protecting innocent women and children. Eleanor was beginning to understand the tragedy's shape, and realization was making her physically ill. So, you killed Joseph Three Horses to prevent him from pursuing legal claims. We protected our community from a savage trying to steal everything we'd worked to build. Doyle corrected with firm conviction. Then Marcus? Eleanor asked, though part of her already knew with cold certainty. Doyle's face went very still. And Eleanor saw fear flicker behind his pale eyes. For the first time, fear of exposure of consequences of truths successfully buried for 15 years, but now threatening to surface. Your husband's death was a tragedy. Doyle said carefully, each word chosen with minefield precision. Pneumonia took many good people that winter. Marcus wasn't sick when Joseph Three Horses was killed. Eleanor said, understanding flooding through her with revelation force. His illness came later, developed slowly over several months in late 1851, got progressively worse, despite the doctor's treatments. She looked directly into Doyle's eyes and saw truth reflected there like sunlight on water, clear and undeniable, despite his attempts to maintain protective fiction. You poisoned him, Eleanor said, voice steady despite the accusation's magnitude. Slowly, carefully over months, using something that would mimic natural illness symptoms. You killed my husband because he was gathering evidence that would have exposed what you did to Joseph Three Horses. Doyle went pale, but his weathered hand was already moving toward his hip gun with practiced motion of someone who'd always known this moment might arrive. That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Drake, he said, voice carrying the flat tone of a man preparing for violence. The kind that could get a person into trouble they can't handle. Eleanor realized with crystalline clarity that she stood at the epicenter of 15 years of buried secrets and accumulated guilt, and that the next few minutes would determine whether truth and justice finally prevailed, or whether more blood would be spilled to protect lies that had already cost too many lives. In the corral, Nashoba was preparing to mount the stallion, unaware that his quest for answers was about to collide with Eleanor's growing understanding of her husband's murder in ways that would change everything for everyone present. The sun continued its relentless descent, and Eleanor Drake was about to discover that some secrets were worth killing to protect. The confrontation Eleanor had been unconsciously dreading finally erupted as the sun began painting the sky in ominous shades of copper and gold. She was counting out $400 in cash money withdrawn from the town bank that morning in hopeful anticipation when Ben Doyle's weathered hand disappeared beneath his work vest. Eleanor caught the movement and felt ice flood her veins as she recognized the gesture witnessed countless times during frontier years, usually in moments before someone died. Ben don't. But her warning came too late. Doyle's hand emerged, gripping a sawed-off shotgun twin barrels swinging toward Nashoba with lethal precision, while his face twisted into 15 years' worth of buried fear and hatred. Nobody's paying this murdering savage a damn cent. Doyle's snarled voice carrying across the square with startling volume. And nobody's letting him ride out alive to bring his whole cursed tribe back for revenge. The crowd exploded into chaos as people scattered like startled cattle voices, raised in panic and excitement, as men dove for cover behind barrels posts and dubious shelter of nearby buildings. But Eleanor noticed with growing alarm that not everyone was running. Several townsmen were moving closer, faces showing the peculiar mixture of fear and bloodlust that violence bred in certain frontier dwellers. The shotgun boomed buckshot whistling past Nashoba's head as he threw himself sideways off the stallion. The horse screamed and reared as pellets struck the corral fence, sending splinters flying. Eleanor didn't think or calculate. She simply reacted with fierce protectiveness, swinging her silver-headed walking stick with all her strength. The heavy knob caught Doyle across the wrist with breaking kindling sound, sending the shotgun spinning into dust while he howled in pain. "Now you interfering bitch, you don't understand what you've done." "I understand exactly what I've done," Eleanor replied, voice deadly calm, despite adrenaline coursing through her system like liquid fire. She bent quickly and retrieved the fallen shotgun, checking both barrels were loaded, before leveling it at her former foreman with steady hands. "I've prevented a murder in broad daylight." But the situation was far from resolved. Sheriff Hawkins had his gun drawn but seemed uncertain where to aim as the confrontation evolved with bewildering speed. The crowd was shouting conflicting advice, some calling for Eleanor to lower her weapon, while others urged someone to shoot the Indian. "Mrs. Drake," Hawkins said carefully, voice strained with effort to maintain authority in a situation spiraling beyond control. "You need to lower that weapon and step away before someone gets killed." "Someone already tried to commit murder, Sheriff," Eleanor replied, without taking her eyes off Doyle, who was clutching his shattered wrist, while pale eyes blazed with pain and fury. "I suggest you arrest the man who just attempted to shoot an unarmed person." "That Indian's got it coming," someone shouted from the crowd. "Eye for an eye." Eleanor swung the shotgun toward the voice without lowering it. Whose eye and for what crime? But Doyle was far from finished. Through sheer determination and 15 years of weapon concealment practice, he managed to produce a small derringer from his boot with his uninjured hand, the nickel-plated pistol gleaming as he aimed it at Nashoba's back. "Drop that scattergun right now, Eleanor," he gasped through gritted teeth, sweat beading from pain and desperate knowledge that his carefully guarded secrets were about to be exposed. "Drop it, or I put a bullet through that savage's spine this second." Eleanor found herself trapped in an impossible position, designed to ensure someone died, regardless of her choice. At this range, even Doyle's small-caliber derringer would be fatal. But if she lowered the shotgun, nothing would prevent him from killing them both. Some townsmen were drawing their own weapons now. Pete Morrison had a revolver out, pointing it vaguely in Nashoba's direction. "Should have stayed on whatever reservation spawned you," he called out. But Billy Cutler suddenly stepped forward, his young face set with unexpected determination. "Put that gun down, Pete. This ain't right, and you know it." "Boy, you better step aside," Morrison warned. "No, sir, I won't. I've seen enough innocent blood spilled in this town." The crowd had gone dead silent, sensing they were about to witness something that would define Deadman's Crossing for generations, the moment when old secrets either stayed buried or erupted with uncontrollable consequences. "You want to know what really happened to his father?" Doyle's voice carried vicious satisfaction, despite his pain. "I'll tell you the whole story since we're being so goddamned honest." The tension ratcheted higher as everyone realized they were about to hear truths hidden for 15 years. That Comanche came to town on May 3, 1838, asking questions about water rights. Doyle continued, voice gaining strength as he settled into a narrative clearly rehearsed many times. Claimed his people had been using our springs for generations, said recent diversions were violating federal treaties. Eleanor's grip tightened on the shotgun. "And my husband supported his claims. Your precious Marcus not only believed that Savage's lies, he wanted to help him prove them in court." Doyle spat, pale eyes blazing with accumulated resentment. "Started gathering evidence, interviewing settlers, building a legal case that would have given Indians the right to waltz in here anytime and take whatever they wanted." The words hung like poison gas when Eleanor saw understanding dawn on several faces, men old enough to remember these events, who had spent 15 years living with knowledge of what they'd participated in or witnessed. "So you killed Joseph 3 Horses on May 15, 1839 to stop him," Eleanor said. "We protected our families from a thieving savage." Doyle shot back with conviction of someone who'd spent 15 years convincing himself murder had been necessary. And when your soft-hearted husband started collecting evidence that could have reopened the whole mess and brought federal investigators down on us, we dealt with that problem too. The admission struck the crowd like physical blow, and Eleanor could see the moment when several men understood they were witnessing confession to not one murder, but two. "You poisoned Marcus," Eleanor said with absolute certainty. "Your husband was weak," Doyle replied without remorse. "Too weak to protect his own people when it required hard choices. We couldn't let him destroy everything we'd built with his misguided ideas about justice for savages." As if summoned by Doyle's venomous words, chaos erupted from multiple directions. Someone in the crowd, Eleanor couldn't identify who fired a shot that went wild, but sent everyone diving for cover. At the same moment, Nashoba used his horse as a shield while reaching for something in his saddlebags. Doyle, sensing his window closing, swung the derringer toward Eleanor with desperate determination. "You should have minded your own business." The derringer's sharp crack was immediately overwhelmed by the thunderous boom of the shotgun. Ben Doyle flew backward into dust, his chest torn open by buckshot and the small pistol spinning away like a discarded toy. Eleanor lowered the smoking weapon, hands steady despite what she'd just done. Around them, the crowd stood in stunned silence, anticipated violence finally spent in an explosion of gunpowder and 15 years overdue justice. But as scattered bills from her attempted payment fluttered around the corral in evening breeze, a small tarnished object had fallen from her coat pocket during the chaos, the metal badge she'd been carrying for 3 years, without fully understanding its significance. Nashoba picked up the badge and turned it over in his hands with reverence of a man touching a sacred relic, dark eyes widening as he recognized engravings and markings carrying profound personal meaning. "This belonged to my father," he said, voice filled with wonder. "Yes," Eleanor replied, understanding flooding through her as final puzzle pieces clicked into place. Joseph Three Horses wasn't just investigating water rights. He was a peace officer. The words struck remaining crowd members like lightning, and Eleanor saw several faces go pale with realization of what she was suggesting. "My father was a duly appointed territorial peace officer," Nashoba said clearly, voice carrying to every person present, "authorized by federal treaty to investigate violations of water rights and other disputes. This badge proves his legal authority and makes his murder a federal crime with no statute of limitations." As full implications settled over Deadman's Crossing like dust from collapsed building, Eleanor understood that justice had finally arrived 15 years late, but carrying the full weight of federal law. The sun continued its descent toward western horizon, painting the desert in shades that seemed entirely appropriate for the bloodshed and revelation that had finally brought truth to light in a place built on lies and maintained through violence. The immediate aftermath of gunfire in Deadman's Crossing was silence so profound Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat. Ben Doyle lay motionless in packed earth, lifeless eyes, reflecting the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Sheriff Tom Hawkins was first to move, approaching Doyle's corpse with careful steps of a man who'd witnessed too much frontier violence. He knelt beside the body, checking for signs of life everyone knew wouldn't be there. "Benjamin Doyle is dead," he announced unnecessarily. Eleanor set the smoking shotgun against the corral fence hands, finally beginning to tremble as reality settled over her. She'd killed a man, not in sudden passion or blind fear, but in cold execution of justice, 15 years in the making. "Mrs. Drake," Sheriff Hawkins said, gently approaching with hat in hands, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me. There'll need to be a formal inquest, official statements, the whole legal process." "Of course, Sheriff," Eleanor replied, voice steadier than she felt. But Nashoba stepped forward, his father's tarnished badge clutched in his fist like vindication talisman. "There won't be any charges filed against Mrs. Drake," he said with quiet authority. Hawkins frowned, uncomfortable, having his jurisdiction questioned. "Son, I appreciate what she did, but the law's the law. She just killed a man in front of 30 witnesses. In defense of a federal peace officer operating under proper territorial authority, Nashoba corrected, holding up the badge so it caught last sunlight rays. My father was investigating legitimate treaty violations when he was murdered by Benjamin Doyle and accomplices 15 years ago. That makes his killing a federal crime, and Mrs. Drake's actions prevented the murder of his designated successor during an official investigation. He looked around at assembled crowd, making sure his words carried to every person present. I am Nashoba Three Horses, son of Joseph. Three Horses, duly appointed peace officer of the Comanche Nation under federal territorial authority. I am also his legally designated successor, authorized to investigate crimes committed against native peace officers. Hawkins stared at the badge with growing recognition. You're a federal lawman. I am. And Mrs. Drake just helped me close a 15-year-old federal murder case by eliminating a suspect who was attempting to kill both an investigating officer and a key witness. Eleanor felt something loosening in her chest, a knot of grief, guilt, and unanswered questions carried since Marcus's death without fully understanding the weight. Her husband hadn't been the weak, sickly man she'd thought him in final months. Marcus had been a crusader for justice, systematically murdered for his principles by a man she'd trusted for over a decade. Marcus knew from the beginning, she said wonderingly. He understood exactly who your father was and what he was trying to accomplish. Nashoba nodded solemnly. Your husband was one of the few white men my father ever learned to trust completely. When Joseph Three Horses came to investigate water rights violations, Marcus offered to help gather evidence because he believed white settlers and native tribes could coexist legally and peacefully if both sides honored their federal obligations. The crowd was beginning to disperse, but several people lingered with expressions suggesting they were grappling with revelations that challenged everything they'd thought they knew about their community's history. Billy Cutler approached hesitantly, hat in hands, and young face twisted with obvious shame. Mrs. Drake, he said quietly, I want you to know that some of us never agreed with what Ben Doyle did either back then or today. But we were too young, too scared to stand up against him. Eleanor studied his earnest expression, recognizing genuine remorse mixed with relief of someone who'd carried a terrible burden for years and was finally free to acknowledge it. But you didn't try to stop it either, did you, Mr. Cutler? No, ma'am, Billy admitted heavily. To our everlasting shame, we didn't. We knew it was wrong, knew innocent people were going to die, but we let it happen because we were too afraid of consequences. As full darkness settled over Deadman's Crossing, Eleanor found herself beside the corral with Nashoba and the magnificent stallion that had been catalyst for everything that unfolded. The horse is yours, she said simply. You've more than earned him, and I suspect he'll be safer with you. Nashoba ran his weathered hand along the stallion's neck, and Eleanor could see the deep connection between them, not just practical bond between horseman and mount, but recognition between two survivors of the same tragedy. He's been waiting all these years, Nashoba said softly. Running wild, staying alive, despite everything that tried to destroy him, waiting for someone who understood his pain. And you. What will you do now that you've found answers? Nashoba considered carefully, dark eyes reflecting torchlight, and something deeper that might have been peace emerging from 15 years of grief. My father's murder has been solved, he said finally. His killer is dead, and truth has been exposed. The debt has been balanced according to both white man's law and Comanche justice. That's not what I asked. For the first time since riding into Deadman's Crossing, Nashoba smiled an expression that transformed his weathered features and revealed glimpses of the man he might have been in a less poisoned world. There's good grazing land in Colorado Territory, he said slowly. Valleys where grass grows sweet and wild, horses still run in herds like they did before fences carved up the range. I think this stallion would like to remember what freedom feels like. Eleanor nodded, understanding more than he'd said aloud. Some wounds could be healed through justice and truth exposure, but others could only be overcome by putting distance between present and painful past. There's something else that belonged to your father, Eleanor said, producing a worn leather journal. Marcus kept detailed records of his investigation. Names, dates, witness statements, everything he gathered trying to build a case that would have cleared your father's name. Nashoba accepted the journal with reverence of a man receiving sacred scripture fingers, tracing familiar handwriting on the cover, where Marcus had written, "The complete truth about Joseph Three Horses and the water rights investigation of 1838-1839. This clears his name completely." Eleanor continued watching Nashoba's face as he opened the journal. "It proves beyond doubt that your father was a legitimate peace officer investigating legitimate treaty violations. It proves the lynching was murder, not justice and documents, everyone who participated in the conspiracy." Nashoba read the first entry aloud, voice thick with emotion. Joseph Three Horses arrived in Deadman's Crossing on May 3, 1838, carrying proper federal credentials to investigate water rights violations. He is a man of unquestionable honor, operating within legal authority. If I cannot prevent the mob Benjamin Doyle is organizing from murdering an innocent federal officer, I will at least ensure history records the truth of his mission and the injustice of his death. "Your husband was a brave man," Nashoba said quietly. "Brave and perhaps foolishly idealistic." Eleanor replied with sad smile, carrying 15 years of grief and newly discovered pride. A dangerous combination on the frontier, but exactly the kind of courage that might eventually make this country worthy of the dreams that brought people here. As Nashoba prepared to mount the stallion for his final departure, Eleanor noticed something she hadn't seen clearly before. A small scar on the horse's forehead, roughly star-shaped like a brand obscured by time, but still carrying unmistakable meaning. "That mark on his forehead," she said, pointing to the faint scar. "I've seen similar markings in Marcus's breeding records." Nashoba followed her gaze and nodded with grim satisfaction. "The star brand," he said with fierce pride. "My father developed it 20 years ago to mark horses from his breeding program. Animals selected for intelligent stamina and ability to survive in harsh country. This stallion isn't just descended from wild Mustang stock. He's directly descended from my family's carefully developed bloodline." The revelation struck Eleanor like lightning, illuminating the final puzzle piece that had been hidden in plain sight. Then the livestock auction wasn't coincidental, she realized. You'd been tracking this specific animal. For nearly 2 years, Nashoba confirmed, swinging into the saddle with fluid grace. Following rumors and stories, tracking stolen horses through networks of traders and auctions, hoping to recover the last remnant of my father's life work before it disappeared forever. Eleanor felt the perfect symmetry settling into her consciousness, the son of a murdered peace officer recovering his rightful inheritance from the widow. Of the man who'd tried to save his father's life, justice finally served after 15 years of secrets and lies. "Where will you take him?" "There's a valley in the Colorado Rockies where my mother's people still maintain winter camps." Nashoba replied, the stallion dancing with eagerness. "The grass grows sweet there, and wild horses still run in herds large enough to maintain themselves. I think he'd like to remember what it feels like to be part of something larger than individual survival." Eleanor nodded, understanding the need to return to places where healing was possible, and the future might hold more promise than the pain-soaked ground of Deadman's Crossing. "And after you've delivered him safely, there are other wrongs that need to be righted, other stories that need to be told before they're lost forever," he said with purpose, suggesting this day had been a beginning rather than ending. "The frontier is changing, Mrs. Drake. Maybe it's time someone made sure it changes in directions that honor justice and truth, rather than rewarding whoever uses the most violence." As he turned the stallion north, Eleanor called after him one final time. "Oh, Nashoba, your father would be proud. Justice delayed isn't justice denied as long as good people refuse to let evil triumph through silence." He touched his hat brim in farewell, then urged the stallion into a ground-eating lope that carried them quickly beyond the torchlight circle and into the vast desert darkness. Eleanor watched until hoofbeats faded completely, leaving her alone in the square, where so much truth had finally been exposed and so much long-delayed justice had finally been served. 3 days later, Eleanor stood on her ranch house porch as morning sun painted the eastern sky in shades promising new beginnings rather than mere continuation of old patterns. Sheriff Hawkins was riding up the dusty trail with official news from the territorial capital. Federal marshals confirmed everything. Hawkins reported as he dismounted respectfully. Joseph Three Horses was indeed a legitimate territorial peace officer authorized by federal treaty to investigate water rights violations. The territorial governor issued a formal apology to the Comanche nation and ordered complete investigation into other unsolved cases from that period. Too little and far too late, Eleanor observed without bitterness. Maybe so, but it's a start. There's also been talk about naming the new schoolhouse after your husband in recognition of his efforts on behalf of justice and rule of law. Eleanor considered this thinking of Marcus and his quiet battles against the prejudices that had ultimately claimed his life. He would have preferred a library, she said finally. Marcus always believed education was the most effective weapon against ignorance and hatred. I'll convey that suggestion to the appropriate authorities. There's also been interest from federal investigators in examining your husband's journal. Apparently, there may be other unsolved cases that could benefit from the information Marcus gathered. After Hawkins departed, Eleanor retreated to Marcus's study and opened the journal to the final entry written in increasingly shaky handwriting just days before Doyle's poison had claimed his life. I have failed to save Joseph Three Horses, but perhaps these words will survive to tell the truth that powerful men have tried to bury. The frontier demands harsh choices from all who dare to call it home, but it need not demand the sacrifice of our humanity or our commitment to justice under law. I pray that someday someone with more courage than I have shown will stand up for what is right, regardless of personal cost. Evil triumphs only when good people choose silence over truth, comfort over conscience, personal safety over moral obligation. If these words are ever discovered, let them serve as testament that some men still believed in the possibility of justice, even when surrounded by those who had abandoned such ideals. Let them guide whoever finds them toward actions that might finally balance the scales of justice that have been tilted toward evil for far too long. Eleanor closed the journal carefully, tears flowing as she finally understood the full measure of her husband's courage and the terrible price he had paid for his commitment to truth in a community that had preferred comfortable lies. But the tears weren't entirely composed of grief. Mixed with sorrow was fierce pride in Marcus's moral courage and growing sense of purpose that stretched far beyond Deadman's Crossing toward the possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. She spent the morning drafting letters to territorial officials, federal investigators, and tribal representatives, beginning the long process of transforming Marcus's documented evidence into policy changes that might prevent similar tragedies. There were water rights to be negotiated, honestly treaties to be honored in good faith, and countless opportunities to prove that civilization and justice could coexist without requiring systematic oppression of people whose only crime was being different. Eleanor Drake had money influence and lifetime experience to bring to bear on problems that transcended individual communities. More importantly, she now had the moral clarity that came from finally understanding her husband's true legacy. The Stallion and his new master had vanished beyond the northern horizon. But their story, and the story of Joseph Three Horses, would live on in Marcus's journal pages, in the changed hearts of everyone who'd witnessed what happened in Deadman's Crossing, and in policy changes that would eventually flow from the exposure of long-hidden crimes. As the sun climbed higher, and Eleanor began the practical work of building a more just future on the foundation of acknowledged truth, rather than convenient lies, she reflected on the strange way justice sometimes arrived 15 years late. but carrying the full weight of federal law and the uncompromising power of truth finally spoken aloud. The horse had been tamed through patience and understanding rather than violence and domination. More importantly, the silence had been broken, secrets had been exposed, and the future suddenly held possibilities that stretched as far as the horizon itself and beyond, toward a time when the American frontier might finally become worthy of the best dreams of all the people who had dared to call it home. In the vast emptiness of West Texas, where survival had always depended more on strength than righteousness, that transformation represented hope itself finally given room to grow in soil watered with too much blood, but which might yet produce something worthy of the terrible price paid to plant the seeds of genuine justice in America's unforgiving frontier.